One of the more interesting things that I've run into as I've gotten deeper and deeper into Yu-Gi-Oh are discussions around archetypes that are kind of colloquially being referred to by the Merriam-Webster 2025 Word of the Year, slop. This is a concept that is sort of unique to Yu-Gi-Oh, but in this video today, I want to talk about how these kinds of issues have actually kind of presented themselves in other games and how they manifest differently in other trading card games. What are we talking about when we're talking about slop as a concept? There are a couple of issues you have when you are designing a trading card game or a game as a whole. One kind of thing that you'll hear people talk about all the time with game design is this idea of the queen problem. If you are allowing players to construct their own decks, what do you do to prevent them from just putting the best card in their deck at any number that they want? And that actually, I think, is not a modern problem for trading card games. Card limits really cleanly answer this issue of not just letting someone have 10 copies of the best card on turn one and then 8 copies of the best card for turn two so that they can always have some kind of perfect curve. We just limit the number of copies you're allowed to have in your deck, and theoretically that should relegate that problem to being mostly one where there's maybe some variance involved, where you're gonna draw the best cards more often, and that's gonna be frustrating for your opponents. But it won't, theoretically at least, be an issue. The modern issue, though, that we see a lot more often in Yu-Gi-Oh, but also in other trading card games as well, is what happens when you can take these really powerful packages of cards and put them all together at no cost or at a low deck building cost. I'm going to talk about it first in the Yu-Gi-Oh context and contextualize what's going on there, because I do think it's a unique situation. And then I'm going to talk about it more in the context of other trading card games. And then lastly, I'm going to talk about some ways that we can potentially look at to solve this kind of slop issue. There are a couple of different ways to go about it, certainly. And Yu-Gi-Oh players who are watching the video will already, I think, have a decent idea of the kinds of things that I'm going to suggest. But there are other things that I think we can kind of look at from other trading card games too that are going to help. So what is the issue? What is the slop issue in Yu-Gi-Oh? So Yu-Gi-Oh actually has a very different system for managing what cards you can put in your deck versus basically any other game. Most other trading card games currently that are being played use some kind of system where there are, colors. Typically they have bespoke names based on what game they are being played in, but you'll see this from Magic up through, Riftbound, Star Wars Unlimited, Gundam, Lorcana. All of these games are using these kinds of systems, and even games like Pokemon, right, where you have energy and you're kind of limited to the Pokemon that can use the energy in your deck. All of these games are attempting to constrict what cards you put in your deck by presenting you with an opportunity cost for putting a wider range of cards in your deck. If you build a 4-color deck in Magic, that theoretically comes at the deck building cost of consistency, because you're not going to draw the right color lands all the time. In Yu-Gi-Oh, there isn't this concept of colors. You can ostensibly put any combination of cards in your deck as long as they match the ban and restricted list requirements, right? But Yu-Gi-Oh, in my opinion, actually has a really elegant solution to this problem, which is the archetype system. So in Yu-Gi-Oh, cards are named, and this is something that, coming from a different trading card game, was from a bunch of different trading card games, was weird for me to get the hang of initially. But in Yu-Gi-Oh, like, the literal name of the card is very important, and you will have cards that refer to the specific name of the card. And most cards will have main name of the archetype plus the second, like, actually more descriptive name for the card. So, all the Mitsurugi cards have Mitsurugi in the name, for example. All the Malice cards have Malice in the name. All the Ryziel cards have Ryziel in the name. All the Radiant Typhoon cards have Radiant Typhoon in the name. And this is something where, if you're coming from like a Magic context, would be more like a creature type or a subtype, something like this. But in the Yu-Gi-Oh context, they're literally in the name of the card. And the archetype system is really clever because it theoretically presents this situation where you are incentivized to only put cards from one archetype in your deck so that they synergize together optimally so that you have consistency. And unfortunately, the Konami has sort of insisted on pushing the envelope on how that archetype system is going to work. And in particular, they have been really willing to allow for archetypes to be playable together in a way that has ultimately ended up feeling unhealthy a lot of the times. So this concept in Yu-Gi-Oh! Is referred to as bridging, but the idea is that there are a lot of cases where you can start on cards from one archetype, do some kind of combo involving only cards that are referential to each other, and in Yu-Gi-Oh! You're gonna be able to access like a full line a lot of the times from one card or two cards. But then increasingly what's happened is that they have been printing cards that allow you to take whatever material you finish with at the end of your first combo line and use some of that material to then subsequently start the combo line of another archetype. And what that means is that you can end up in these situations where one combo starter actually ends on an end board with two or sometimes even three archetypes represented. Additionally, there have been more and more issues where archetypes have had ways to get started that don't use the normal summon. And that's pretty important because the normal summon is the most finite resource in a Yu-Gi-Oh! Turn. So theoretically, if you had 4 different archetypes, but all of them required your normal summon to get started, well, that would be fine. You would just have this opportunity cost of putting all 4 of those archetypes in your deck because you would only have the one normal summon per turn. In practice, though, a lot of the time now, you have archetypes where sure, one of them uses the normal summon to get started, but then the next one doesn't even need it. It can just use a special summon of some sort, or maybe it has spells that represent their starters that can get you going. And so as a result, you can kind of jam those things together. And this has manifested in a kind of modern Yu-Gi-Oh! Problem that, again, as I said, has been referred to as slop. It's this idea of you just jam as many archetypes, as many engines into your deck as possible, with the premise being, if I have more gas in my deck, I can theoretically create a higher ceiling end board because I've got more options, more things to be building towards than someone who's maybe staying more dedicated to one archetype. And that's created a bunch of problems recently in a bunch of different ways. I think the one that you can point to from recent Yu-Gi-Oh! History that's the most obvious is Mitsurugi. This is the archetype that is based around ritual summoning reptile monsters. And the way that this engine works is, one, it does not require a normal summon. It, in fact, is startable from one card, which is Habakiri, and Habakiri can be searched in a large number of ways. There are a ton of bridges that get you to Habakiri because there are effects that search for ritual monsters, there are effects that search for reptiles, there are a myriad of ways, all roads, you could say, even perhaps, to lead to Habakiri. And that has presented historically a ton of problems in the format where playing Mitsurugi plus whatever else you were going to play anyway has felt very doable. On Master Duel, it's even more prevalent because many of the bridges that have been banned in the TCG are legal on Master Duel. So that's, I think, a really clean example of something that people find pretty frustrating, right? Like, you saw Mitsurugi Raziel be one of the most powerful decks for what felt like an eternity. You saw decks like Mitsurugi Yummy be one of the most powerful decks for a long period of time as well. And both of these are operating in a very similar way where, sure, if you open on the Mitsurugi combo anyway, then I guess you had both of them in your hand. But importantly, one of them does not require the normal summon. In fact, neither of them require the normal summon in both cases, which is another issue entirely. But in both cases, if you only open on Yummy or if you only open on Raziel, you're still able to get to Mitsurugi. And that causes some issues with just like the overall ceiling of the deck. It is too powerful. There are also like other incidental issues presented by having engines like Mitsurugi be really powerful. And these actually manifest in a way that I thought was kind of interesting when I was looking at it, and I'm coming from kind of a fresh perspective. One thing that I found kind of interesting is that there are these archetypes that are tending to lock you into trying to play towards one particular strategy or maybe two some amount of the time. And most of the extra deck monsters seem to be generally well templated in that regard. They often are going to require like relatively specific material in order to create them, and so as a result, you don't have the easiest way to bridge from one to the other. The one that, at least in my time, has felt the most offensive and the most problematic has actually been Xyz monsters, and that's just because they care mostly about the level of the monsters that are being used to create them. So, like in the modern era, you have decks like Canine Vanquish Soul, which are powerful for a variety of reasons, but among them is the fact that in addition to just being a powerful engine, Vanquish Soul just makes level 5 monsters that can then be used to go get Canine Ripper to go then start the Canine line. And then similarly, a deck that I played a bunch of before it tanked some bans on Master Duel, like the Gimmick Puppet Mitsurugi FTK was powerful because the Gimmick Puppet FTK really just requires you to be able to make 2 level 8s and 2 level 4s. And that's all that matters because the rest of it is all Xyz monsters. And it just so happens that Mitsurugi is very powerful at doing that. And so I think there's this really obvious problem presented by this. And this is not news to any Yu-Gi-Oh players watching. And I'm sure that, probably some number of people have clicked off already because this is really obvious and is something that has been discussed for a while. I think that there's an interesting case study here, though, in that this is actually less of a Yu-Gi-Oh specific issue than it maybe seems. So in Yu-Gi-Oh, the really exacerbated versions of this issue are like 60 card decks with 6 engines, and you're just hoping to draw enough of the starters in your opening hand that you'll maybe get to access 2 or 3 of the engines in a given turn. And those decks are not like the best. Currently, you're typically losing to things that are playing like 2 or maybe 3 engines, but it is frustrating to play against them nonetheless. And that same kind of issue has actually happened in other trading card games like Magic before. And I want to give a couple of examples of some Magic slop that I think should at least make Yu-Gi-Oh players feel better that they're not the only ones who have had to suffer through this. One of the biggest offenders for this actually is a really, really innocuous looking card. So, man, it's been years at this point, but Arkham's Astrolabe was a card that was printed in Modern Horizons 2. The Modern Horizons sets are always somewhat problematic for Magic, and I'll probably make a video talking about why at some point, because it is also something that is kind of interestingly Yu-Gi-Oh related in some ways. But Arkham's Astrolabe is a 1 snow mana artifact that draws a card when it enters, and then it can be used to filter mana from one color into another. And this card is banned in every format it would be legal in, more or less. Might be legal in Vintage. I actually didn't check, but it doesn't see play in exactly Vintage. But it's banned in Legacy, banned in Modern, and banned in Pauper. And a big reason why the card is so frustrating and powerful is that it enables slop. It enables you to play these decks that are really pushing the envelope on what acceptable mana pip considerations are in your deck. So some of the more obvious examples of this are in the Pauper format. You would see decks like Blue-Red Skred, which is typically a blue-red deck. It's playing Snowlands because it's using Skred as its main removal spell. And then all of a sudden it got to include Arkham's Astrolabe, and you would see these Skred lists that instead of being blue-red were blue-red splashing the best white card and the best green card for their strategy at the same time. So you can see how that's like frustrating and problematic. You would also see decks like Jeskai, Ephemerate playing cards like this. Basically anything that could flicker the Astrolabe was also really happy to play it because it also drew cards, which is the other like dirty secret about why this card was so powerful and enabled so much slop, is that it also just like replaced itself, so it fixed mana in that way as well, which is pretty frustrating. Similarly, you had decks like Tron, which could leverage Arkham's Astrolabe quite powerfully. And the reason why these decks felt so good and so frustrating to play against is that they just got to play everything. They got to play all of the best interaction, and they got to play the most premium threats that they wanted to, with no consideration about whether or not there were going to be color issues or mana constrictions based on color, because they had Astrolabe to clean up their mana so much. And Astrolabe was genuinely oppressive. Like, when I think I'm almost underselling how good it was in these formats. In Legacy as well, it had to go basically immediately for similar reasons. In that context, it had less to do with the fact that it allowed you to play too many different colors, and more to do with just the fact that in Legacy, the tolerance for cards that cantrip as well as having an effect is lower. Just broadly speaking, you can't really allow people to access that much of their deck that quickly in Legacy. But Astrolabe was also like incredibly oppressive in Legacy, enabled playing really too many different colors of cards, and it would generate these decks that can only be described as slop. I think quite aptly. Other examples that I could think of, and what's important to note is like not every deck in Magic that's like 4+ colors is necessarily like a slop deck. Like, you can have 4-color decks that still have a focused game plan and are doing something in a really like deliberate way, and are just happen to be splashing a 4th color maybe like very gently or very lightly in order to get access to like one particular effect. But there are decks that are just, once you start getting into like, I'm just playing the full 4 colors to just get every best card I can play, that's certainly when you get into that territory. I think another good example of this is there was a deck that was popular in Standard somewhat recently that was 5 colors, 5-color Fires of Invention, and this was a deck that was basically playing 4 of the card Fires of Invention, which was a 4-mana enchantment that just lets you cast exactly 2 spells for free, equal to or less than, with mana cost equal to or less than the amount of lands you had in play. And so this deck was literally just trying to put fires in play and then just play big stuff every turn. And again, because this circumvented the mana requirements, you would be playing the best things that you could be playing under the constrictions of fires. That was also, I think, reasonably describable as kind of a slop deck. It was something where you just like, we're just putting all the best cards in the deck with basically no consideration of their mana cost, because you weren't planning to play them for their mana costs. So that's another issue for sure. Another one that has come up a lot for me somewhat recently. So my favorite format is Canadian Highlander, and in the last couple of years in particular, the mana bases in Canadian Highlander, with the advent of Surveil Land, with the advent of Surveil Lands, and with the proliferation of more and more dual lands, even the tri-lands, it has made it so that the deck building costs around playing 4-color have really never been lower. Historically in Canadian Highlander, there were deck building costs to playing 4-color, both in the sense that you might just lose to your own mana because you only have 1 of each land in your deck. It's a singleton format, so you might just lose to not drawing the right color combination of mana. But then in addition to that, there was also a decent amount of decks playing cards like Blood Moon and Wasteland and Strip Mine that could punish you if you had a weak draw where you were really heavily dependent on one particular land. You might lose that one, or you might get Blood Moon and you might lose. Increasingly, the mana has gotten so much better, and overall card quality has increased so much that there has been this real rise to prevalence of whatever the 4 best colors are, blue plus 3 other colors. Spoiler alert, blue is always in these decks more or less, has really risen to this level of being incredibly problematic. And The Canadian Highlander Council took some action against that recently in assigning a bunch of points to smaller cards that went in these decks, but it really is like just a challenging battle to fight, because there is not a really clean way, in Magic at least, to disincentivize people from playing just all of the best cards if the mana is good. In rotating formats, the mana gets better and worse, so you don't run into that problem as much. And in some cases, the thing that is enabling the slop is really acute, like Arkham's Astrolabe or Fires of Invention. But in some of these older formats where you just have great mana, you are just running into these situations where people are just playing 4 colors, typically linchpinned by blue, and then you're playing the rest of the best stuff that you can fit in with this. So it's not a Yu-Gi-Oh specific problem. It's definitely something that comes up in other games as well. Magic, chief amongst them, from my experience, is one that has had serious issues with this. And I think that there are a couple of things that we can look at for solutions to the quote-unquote slop problem. So firstly, let's look at what a lot of the modern game design approaches have been around this, because I think that this is maybe like the level 1 solution. If you're building a new game, this seems to be the cleanest way to do it, which is that a lot of modern games just literally won't let you put the cards in your deck. So if we look at games like Lorcana, Riftbound, you just can't. You're not allowed to put more than 2 colors worth of cards in your deck. It is illegal, and as a result, you're kind of artificially constraining just how much slop problems you can run into. Same thing, One Piece the same way, right? You're exceptionally gated to, or you're gated to specific colors with no exceptions. You can't get access to them for an additional cost. You can't put resources in your deck that allow you to play things that are outside of your leader or your color combination. And that's, I think, the most like heavy-handed way of approaching this situation and solving it. I do think, and especially for new games, this is true. I think this is the best solution, frankly. It just alleviates so much game design pressure to be able to say, well, we think this card is really powerful with this other card, but if we know that they're never going to be allowed to be in the same deck, then it's fine. And that's, I think, going to be something you're going to see more and more modern games moving towards. If you look at even some systems like the new Cyberpunk TCG, like they are allowing you to configure what your deck looks like, but they're using kind of a hybrid system where you can have up to 3 colors in your deck, but you are only getting 2 RAM, quote unquote, per leader that you choose of that color, which means that you don't get to play the best cards from a color if you're not willing to put the investment in to also register enough legends of that color. So I think that's also a pretty clever solution, a way to kind of appropriately gate the power level of cards that are going to be going into decks. But how do we do it for games that already exist, that have already established these resource systems that are problematic for slop? Let's talk about it in a couple of different ways. In the Magic context, increasingly, it's actually been more about kind of not necessarily subtracting from the slop decks, but rather incentivizing more focused strategies. So something that happened at the recent Pro Tour that I thought was very interesting was that in the return to Lorwyn, they printed a bunch of cards that cared about elementals. And I thought that there was this really interesting dynamic where going into the tournament, there was a concern that this 4-color Badger Mole Cub deck was going to be oppressive. Badger Mole Cub is a 2-drop that generates a lot of mana, and it was enabling these 3 and 4-color green strategies that were just these exceptionally powerful mid-range decks that would get a lot of material on the board quite quickly and overwhelm their opponents. But in the return to, in the Lorwyn Eclipsed, in the most recent set, they did print a couple of cards that were really archetype specific that were exceptionally good against this particular kind of deck. And I think that that's the kind of design that you kind of need going forward. I'm totally blanking on the name of this card that I really loved. Give me one second. Okay, I've done it. The card that I really liked is called Sunderflock. That's the one. So Sunderflock is a 9 mana card, but it costs X less, where X is the greatest mana value among elementals you control. And so this was a way to uh, really deliberately incentivize playing particular configurations of a deck. And sorry, the additional text on this card is that it's a 5/5 flying that when it enters, you return all non-elementals to their to controllers' hands. And or to their owner's hands, sorry. And so this actually was very good against Badger Mole Cub. Completely dunked on it, to be completely honest. And so this is a really clever way to kind of incentivize playing a more focused strategy by providing really powerful payoffs, but requiring you to make considered deck building choices. And the nice thing about this is that the ways that you get to playing a bunch of elementals can be different. So there were a couple of different iterations of how people were playing this deck. With Sunderflock, there were some people who were playing this kind of like spell slinger build that was looking to put into play cards like Hearth Elemental and Eddy Merc Crab, which get cheaper to play depending on how many instants and sorceries are in your graveyard. And then you also had people who were playing 4-color versions of this deck. And again, like I mentioned, just because something is 4-color doesn't mean it's slop. And they were playing 4-color versions of this deck that were playing a bunch of bigger elementals, like the elementals that just cost 5 mana but had powerful effects, and it was using those to then bridge into playing Sunderflock. And I think that kind of card design is very clever. It requires considered deck building concessions, both in terms of the other cards that you put in your deck and the colors that you put in your deck. And it is importantly not very splashable. It's not something that goes into other decks very well because the effect is so focused on elementals. Now, granted, this effect also exists in Yu-Gi-Oh! This is something that people have done, or that Konami has done for a long time, and it's something that I think they realistically need to do more of, and that is the idea of locks. And so this is, I think, the big thing that if you're an enfranchised Yu-Gi-Oh! Player, it is what players have been asking for a while now, is for cards to be templated in a way where once you play them, you are locked into playing that archetype, and you can't then subsequently bridge into other things. And there's a lot of good reasons for forcing people into locks. One of them is it actually allows you, I think, to put more power in Edboard pieces from particular archetypes, which theoretically can be more fun. I don't know if you necessarily want that, but if cards are appropriately locked and gated behind certain things, it certainly allows you to be a bit more liberal with where you put your power. If you aren't locking things and you aren't forcing people to stay in one archetype after you play the card, then obviously there is now this requirement that you have to check against every other card in Yu-Gi-Oh's history to make sure that it's not going to fundamentally break something and unlock some combo that you really don't necessarily want players to have access to. So locks is, I think, number one. Number two, and this is the bigger one for me, I think that there should be the Konami has clearly started to try and do this, but non-engine pieces being generic is, I think, broadly speaking, a problem in Yu-Gi-Oh! I think that going forward, if you were to put non-engine into archetypes and have those cards also kind of lock you into particular archetypes, that would also have positive deck building outcomes. Like, you can imagine a scenario where even some of the most frustrating non-engine, like say like Droll and Lockbird, if that was gated in a way such that after you activated Droll and Lockbird, you were locked into spellcasters, for example, it would all of a sudden mean that you would have to make choices between archetypes that maybe have access to more powerful non-engine and archetypes that maybe have access to more powerful engine pieces. And maybe it would be a matter of trying to enmesh those two things together and find ways where maybe when you were going second, you would get access to your non-engine in a way where you still felt like you could win the game if you got to your turn. I think overall, that's the kind of design space that Yu-Gi-Oh! Would be incentivized to move towards. And I think that with those two things combined, you could start to resolve the issues of Slop. I know that they caused a bunch of problems, in particular in the tier limit strategy, but cards like the Heralds of green light and orange light, I think are good examples of this. They're very, I think these are clever and well designed cards, right? Where they require you to be playing, I think it's fairies. You have to have fairies, but then they give you access to these powerful hand traps. That to me is way more in line where it would be appropriate to be putting this kind of power rather than having it be generic and in things like Ash Blossom. The Ash Blossom discussion, it's a different video. I will make it eventually. If you've made it all the way towards the end of this one, then let me know if you want to hear my thoughts on Ash. I've been slowly constructing them. I didn't want to fly off the handle and say things before I'd had more time to play and really think about it. But yeah, that's sort of the slop problem, I think. And it's certainly an interesting one. It is not one that is unique to Yu-Gi-Oh, despite it being, I think, endemic to Yu-Gi-Oh, I would say. It's not a term that I have heard used in TCGs other than Yu-Gi-Oh for the most part. It is obviously a confounding deck building issue. It's a problematic issue for power level, and certainly something that it seems like Konami is starting to get a handle on. They've obviously in the TCGs started to ban a lot of these really obnoxious bridges to at least limit the efficacy. And going forward, I guess you would hope that they start to put more meaningful locks on cards, that they start to make choices around deck, force you to make choices around deck building that are going to lock you into fewer archetypes, ideally. Let me know in the comments how many archetypes you think are appropriate to be in one deck. Like, do you think that 2 engines is already too much? Like, if you see a deck that is something plus Fiendsmith, is that already frustrating? Or are you okay with a certain number of engines as long as they're being used kind of like laterally, maybe, where they do different things on the end board as opposed to just generically raising the ceiling? I'm curious what you think. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Obviously, if you've made it all the way to the end of this video, I really appreciate it. This is one that I was thinking about a lot this weekend, and I just decided to get it out. I hope you enjoyed, and without further ado, I'll see you in the next one.